They forced me out like I was nothing, early retirement, no warning. But what they didn't know, I was holding the keys to the very building they worked in, and I was about to show them who really had the power. My name is Mark Sullivan. For nearly 25 years, I worked as the regional manager for a mid-sized tech company in downtown Chicago. I wasn't just an employee. I was someone who helped build the company's reputation, who knew every corner of the business like the back of my hand. I took pride in what I did. Every morning, I walked into that office with purpose. But that purpose was about to be ripped away from me in the most humiliating way possible. It started with a phone call. I was in a meeting when my assistant, Jenna, quietly stepped in and handed me a plain envelope. No note, no warning, just a cold, official-looking letter. My hands trembled as I opened it, and the words hit me like a gut punch. Effective immediately, you are being offered early retirement. Just like that. No discussion, no chance to defend myself. It felt like I was being shoved out the door before I was ready. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Early retirement. At 55, I had so much more to give. I had plans, goals, and dreams, both for the company and for myself, but they didn't care. The higher-ups said it was business strategy, streamlining operations, and making way for younger talent. I felt invisible, like I'd become nothing more than a statistic in some corporate spreadsheet. The betrayal burned deep, sharper than I expected. I walked out of that office that day carrying a box of my things, but inside I was empty. The familiar hum of the building, the chatter of colleagues, the deadlines, they all felt like memories fading away. I kept thinking, how did it come to this? After years of loyalty, was this really how they saw me? The frustration and hurt swirled inside me, an ache I couldn't shake. But beneath that pain, something else began to stir, a quiet anger mixed with disbelief. I didn't just want to fade away. There was more to this story. And as I left the building for the last time, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. After that day, life felt like I'd been thrown into an endless fog. The office, the meetings, the constant rush of work, all gone overnight. I had been so wrapped up in my job for so long that without it, I didn't know who I was anymore. Mark Sullivan, regional manager, was suddenly just Mark, and that was terrifying. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up each morning expecting to head to work, only to realize I didn't have anywhere to go. My routine vanished, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. I tried to keep busy, reading, going for walks, even helping around the house, but nothing filled the void. The silence in the house was deafening. I felt isolated, like I was watching the world move on without me. Friends stopped calling as often, and the questions from family about what's next made me feel even more trapped. I'd catch myself staring out the window for hours, thinking about everything I'd lost, the respect, the purpose, the camaraderie. It wasn't just a job taken from me, it was a part of my identity. Doubt crept in slowly but surely. Was I really too old? Was there any chance of coming back? Every time I tried to imagine a new path, the uncertainty crushed me. I was angry at the company, at the people who'd forced me out like I was a disposable tool. But mostly I was angry at myself for feeling so powerless. One night I sat alone in my study, staring at the framed photo of the office building that hung on my wall. That building had been my second home, the place where I'd poured my heart and soul for decades. And then a flicker of a thought hit me, something I hadn't considered before. A secret I had kept quiet all these years, something that might change everything. You see, while I was busy climbing the corporate ladder, I had quietly bought the building where the company's headquarters stood. No one knew, not my bosses, not my colleagues, not even my family. It was my insurance, a secret asset I'd kept tucked away. And suddenly that quiet realization gave me a spark of hope. Maybe this forced retirement wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the beginning of a new kind of fight. I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, but I wasn't ready to disappear quietly. Not when I held the key to the very place that had cast me aside. That secret, the ownership of the building, was something I had never shared with anyone. For years, I quietly invested in the property, making sure everything was under my name, tucked away in a trust to keep it safe and private. It was my little safety net, a quiet assurance that no matter what happened in the corporate world, I had something real to hold on to. But now it felt like my secret weapon. As I sat in my living room, the weight of that knowledge settled over me. I owned the very place where my former bosses and coworkers showed no respect for me, the place that had been my second home and then my exile. It was almost poetic, in a way I couldn't ignore. I started to research my options carefully. What rights did I have as a landlord? What leverage could I possibly hold over the company now? The more I learned, the more my initial despair turned into cautious optimism. I wasn't just some powerless retiree. I was a landlord, a property owner with legal control over the space they occupied. But this wasn't about petty revenge. I wanted to be smart about this. I wanted to reclaim my dignity and find justice without burning bridges or causing chaos that would make me lose what little control I still had. My plan had to be quiet, steady, and impactful, like the slow tightening of a rope, not a sudden snap. Still, it wasn't easy to sit on this secret. The temptation to just call the shots and make a scene was strong, but I knew that wouldn't serve me in the long run. I had to be patient, to watch and wait, to find the right moment to act, the moment when my hidden power would hit the hardest. Every day, I checked in on the building from afar, watching the comings and goings of the company. I heard whispers about budget cuts, leadership struggles, and staff layoffs. It seemed the company wasn't doing as well without me. That bittersweet knowledge filled me with a mix of sadness and quiet satisfaction. I wasn't just a victim of their corporate games anymore. I had my own game to play now, and I was determined to win it on my terms. From my quiet vantage point, I became an invisible observer. Every morning, I'd drive by the building, watch employees scurry inside, hear the distant buzz of activity. But now, I wasn't part of that world anymore. I was outside looking in, no longer the respected manager, just a stranger who once owned their trust. What stung the most was how the company started to unravel without me. Rumors spread about missed deadlines, internal conflicts, and poor decisions from the new management. I could almost feel the weight of their struggle, like a slow-motion collapse I was powerless to stop. Except deep down, I knew I wasn't powerless at all. The employees I used to mentor passed me by in the parking lot without recognition. The new bosses never once looked my way. Their confidence seemed brittle, their faces tight with stress. The place felt less like a family and more like a sinking ship. It was hard not to feel a pang of sorrow. After all, I cared about this company, about the people I worked with for years. But beneath that sorrow was a growing sense of quiet satisfaction. They had thought forcing me out would weaken me. Instead, it had given me a new kind of strength, one they would never see coming. I started to document everything: the company's financial troubles, changes in management, signs of tension. This wasn't about bitterness, it was about preparation. I needed to be ready when the moment to step in arrived. Even as I watched, I reminded myself not to rush. Patience was key. There was no need to gloat or act impulsively. The best power is the power they don't know you have. It was strange to be connected to this place without walking its halls every day. Yet, knowing I held the keys, literally, made every passing day feel like a step closer to reclaiming control. The silent observer was becoming the quiet strategist. And so I waited, watched, learned. The company was struggling, and I was ready. Owning that building wasn't just a quiet victory, it was a game changer. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much control I actually had. As the landlord, I could influence their entire operation without ever stepping back inside the office. It was a power I'd never expected to hold, and now I planned to use it wisely. The company had been slipping financially, and their lease was a big monthly expense. I reviewed the lease agreement carefully, making sure I understood every clause. If they wanted to stay in that space, they had to follow the rules. Rules I was ready to enforce for the first time. No more overlooking small things or giving favors like I had in the past when I was part of the team. I began drafting letters, formal but firm, reminding them of their responsibilities. The maintenance fees, the rent deadlines, the building policies, every detail mattered, and I wasn't about to let them slack off anymore. I wasn't doing this to be cruel, I was reclaiming respect. If they thought they could just push me out and get away with it, they were mistaken. The weight of this power surprised me. I wasn't just a former employee, I was the landlord who controlled the roof over their heads. It was a strange feeling, mixing pride and a hint of satisfaction with a careful sense of restraint. I didn't want to destroy the company, just remind them who they owed their home to. At the same time, I was learning something about myself. I realized that my identity wasn't tied solely to the job title or the daily grind. I was more than just the regional manager they forced out. I was resourceful, patient, and capable of turning the tables in ways they never imagined. I could feel a shift inside me. The helplessness was fading, replaced by a quiet confidence. This wasn't about revenge. It was about taking control of my story on my terms. And with the keys to the building in my hands, I was finally ready to start writing the next chapter. I knew that making big moves too fast would only backfire, So I took a quiet, calculated approach. I began sending official notices reminding them about rent increases and maintenance responsibilities. Nothing aggressive, just firm reminders of their obligations as tenants. The tone was professional, calm, because I didn't want this to feel like a personal attack, even if deep down it was. At first, the company's reaction was subtle. A few grumbles from the finance team, whispered complaints about the rising costs. But as the months passed and the rent crept up to market rates, the tension became harder to ignore. I could tell things were starting to strain behind those glass windows. Driving by each day, I saw the stress on the faces of the managers and employees. Their energy felt different, more frantic, less sure. And even though I was no longer part of their world, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vindication. They'd treated me like I was expendable, but I was still here, controlling the space they couldn't afford to lose. I also made sure to maintain the building's upkeep, investing quietly in repairs and upgrades. I wanted the place to shine, a reminder that I wasn't neglecting my responsibility. If they wanted to stay, they'd have to meet my terms, and I'd hold my end of the bargain with pride. But I kept my distance. No confrontations, no dramatic calls, just the steady pressure of a landlord who meant business. It was a slow burn, but I could see it working. The company was beginning to feel the weight of my ownership in every budget meeting and every anxious glance toward the lease agreement. Even though I was outside the walls now, I was influencing every decision they made. And that quiet power was sweeter than I expected. The pressure I'd been applying quietly was starting to show cracks in the company's armor. Budget meetings grew tense, and I could almost hear the whispered worries about how they were going to cover the rising rent. The quiet complaints had turned into heated debates behind closed doors. Without me managing things on the inside, the strain was mounting fast. One afternoon, I drove past the building and noticed a for lease sign taped to a window. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't for my space, but for a nearby office, clearly a sign of the company's turmoil spilling over. I realized this was bigger than just rent payments. The company was struggling to stay afloat in more ways than one. It was a strange feeling watching it all unfold from the sidelines. Part of me felt sorry for the people I once worked with, the ones caught in the middle of decisions made by bosses who didn't have a clue. But another part of me felt a quiet satisfaction. They'd pushed me out without a second thought. Now they were learning what it meant to lose control. The tension inside the building was palpable, even from a distance. I could almost imagine the frustrated voices, the hurried phone calls, the late nights trying to balance the books. My ownership wasn't just a fact on paper anymore, it was a real force shaking their foundation. Still, I held back from making a direct move. Patience had been my ally, and I wasn't about to lose it now. I needed to wait for the right moment, the perfect opening to step in with authority. This tipping point was close. I could feel it in every rising cost and every worried glance. As the company's walls trembled, I prepared myself mentally for the confrontation ahead. I wasn't just a retired manager anymore. I was a landlord with power, a man ready to reclaim respect and control. And soon they'd have to face me. The day finally came when I decided it was time to step out of the shadows. I scheduled a meeting with the company's new leadership, people who had once dismissed me without a second thought. Walking into that conference room felt strange, a mix of nostalgia and quiet determination swirling inside me. I laid everything out calmly and clearly. The overdue payments, the rising rent, the lease terms they'd been ignoring. There was no anger in my voice, no threats, just facts. But the weight behind my words was unmistakable. I wasn't here to negotiate or beg. I was here to remind them who owned the ground beneath their feet. Their faces changed as I spoke. The smugness faded into nervousness, then into outright panic. For years, I had been invisible to them, but now I was a force they couldn't ignore. I watched as they scrambled to process the reality of their situation, how they'd taken me for granted and now faced consequences. But more than the business battle, this was personal. I could feel the satisfaction of reclaiming my dignity, of standing tall after being pushed aside. It was a quiet victory, not loud or messy, but firm and undeniable. I'd been wronged, yes, but I wasn't going to let that define me. They asked if I planned to evict them. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I told them I wanted a fair deal, respect and responsibility on both sides. I wanted to see if this broken company could find its footing with honesty and mutual understanding. But the power balance had shifted. This time, it was clear who held the cards. Leaving that room, I felt something I hadn't in months: control, not just over the building, but over my own story. I was no longer a victim. I was the man who'd quietly taken back his power, and there was no turning back. After the meeting, things shifted in ways I hadn't fully expected. The company's leaders came back with a proposal, one that acknowledged their mistakes and expressed a willingness to work with me. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw a glimpse of respect. I realized this wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity and showing that I still mattered. The company, flawed as it was, needed me more than they ever admitted, and I wasn't about to disappear quietly into retirement. Over the next few weeks, I negotiated terms that protected my investment but also gave the company a chance to recover. I wasn't interested in crushing them. I wanted a partnership built on honesty. Watching them scramble to meet their obligations was satisfying, but I also understood the pressure they faced. I kept reminding myself that this was a fresh start, not just for the company, but for me. I was no longer the betrayed employee, but a man who owned his past and shaped his future. That control, that power, gave me a new sense of purpose. Slowly, I began to reconnect with some of my old colleagues, not as their boss, but as someone who had been through the storm and come out stronger. Those relationships mattered. They reminded me that beneath all the corporate games and politics, there were real people, people I cared about. For the first time in a long time, I felt hope, not the kind that depends on someone else, but the kind that comes from within. I was ready to face whatever came next, on my terms. With the lease renegotiated and the company stabilizing, I finally felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The bitter sting of being forced out slowly faded, replaced by a quiet pride in how I'd handled everything. This wasn't the ending I'd feared. It was a new beginning, one I shaped with patience and strength. I still drove by the building every day, but now the view felt different. It wasn't just the place where I once worked or the site of my retirement humiliation. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when life pushes you down, you can rise again, stronger and wiser. I reconnected with former colleagues who reached out, inspired by how I took back control without bitterness or rage. Those conversations reminded me that respect is earned, not demanded, and sometimes the most powerful moves are the quietest ones. I also found new projects outside the company, things I never had time for before. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing the lessons I'd learned from years in the corporate trenches and from this unexpected journey. Helping others grow gave me a renewed sense of purpose. Most importantly, I learned that identity isn't tied to a job title or a paycheck. It's about how you face challenges, how you hold onto your dignity when the world tries to strip it away. I was no longer just Mark Sullivan, the retired regional manager. I was Mark Sullivan, the man who owned his story, who refused to be invisible, and who reclaimed his power in a way no one saw coming. Life had pushed me into early retirement, but it hadn't defeated me. Instead, it had opened a door, and I stepped through it, ready for whatever came next.